We might talk about what's going on in Mali. I might wait another day for the picture to clear, because I have a sneaking suspicion that the offensive from the forces, both the jihadi coalition that is working with the Azawad Liberation Organization, as they continue offensive operations, and they've had that alliance before, and it's been a brutal alliance that's been very effective until Azawad gets boxed out by the jihadis, which is what happened last time. But maybe Azawad thinks it'll be different this time. They're coordinating these attacks with them in order to take cities that the Russians took back years ago and are now losing them again. The Russians got surrounded, a bunch of Russians got murked. You know, propaganda is like going everywhere, trying to like pull you in this way and that way. What we know is that a big city in the north of the country has fallen, and there's expected offensives across 2 more cities that these organizations have caught for, you know, captured over decades and decades of struggle in the north, primarily among Tuareg separatist groups that make up the Azawad Liberation Organization and jihadis. And they're engaging in more and more offensives towards the Malian government, the one that couped the government before it, and then, you know, was like, elections, that's fun, never mind. And as like, we were in a state of like national emergency, so we can't be doing stuff like that. You know, they need to, you know, concentrate resources, concentrate the nation towards the purpose of national stabilization and, you know, self-sufficiency. And then they failed to defend themselves, in part because, you know, switching the French for the Russians has not in the long term been as beneficial as it was in the immediacy after they switched, I'm just going to say switched alliances from French support, even though that's not as clear as what happened, as French support for Russian support. But in the immediate term, the Russians had success. They've also had success in Central Africa. There's been brutalities that tinge the outsides of that success, especially since we're talking about the Africa Corps, which used to be known as the Wagner Group. For any of you at home that don't know what's going on with the Wagner Group, we'll just say that they're a rough and tumble gang of fellas. And that means that that type of stuff can be exported to these nations. That's not to say UN forces have ever been perfect in places like Haiti, with, for example, the rapes that took place and the abandonment of the pregnant women. That was quite brutal. Of course, American forces have done some brutish things, but the Wagner Group is just a group of brutes. There's not like, oh, there's the good one. It's not like a, there's, I imagine there's some people that are nice in the organization, like generally speaking, interpersonally, but when it comes to the culture of the organization, the culture is, we're violent thugs, and they've also recruited a ton from prisons. The chief of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was a thug and was used by Putin for that reason, kept much of the prison codes that were imported into Wagner, especially when it came to like things like the untouchables and the touchables and keeping them separated. And that didn't always work everywhere, which caused some issues, but his knowledge of the system allowed him to segregate it in a certain manner. And the prison culture importation, the brutality of how it acted in Syria. I mean, the sledgehammer execution of that Russian soldier who surrendered and then was returned to the Russians, that wasn't the first time a sledgehammer video had gone viral for Wagner. It had actually gone viral way back in Syria when a draftee for the government of Bashar al-Assad, for, you know, the Syrian, the Syrian army, the Syrian military forces, whatever, he had his like leg smashed by sledgehammers because he didn't want to fight. So that's the first sledgehammer video I remember Wagner being associated with. But I might be forgetting other sledgehammer videos. But I mean, they're like, they gift sledgehammers as like a meme. So I mean, they're that's like the culture. That's like, ha ha ha, here's that execution tool we use. Ha 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 ha. So anyway, long term, these guys have been strained by other conflicts. They've been strained by, of course, the Russians not being able to dedicate more forces when there's like a coordinated offensive, because, you know, they're dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They're continuing to conduct it. And so they've gotten less support. And the government that has couped the last one hasn't stabilized the country. They haven't been able to do it. And so that, combined with Russia's strained forces and inability to surge in moments like this, led to the Russians even negotiating a deal where they evacuated from Mali, where they called them and said to the rebels, to the jihadists and to Azawad, like, hey, can we leave? We're surrounded. We're surrounded, and I'm trying to think like of a prominent piece of infrastructure in the northern city of Mali, but I'm sorry, I can't think of it. It's the tomato paste factory, or whatever it is. We're holed up here. We need to get out. We're surrounded on all sides, and they agreed to let them out if they did not continue to engage. And of course, they left, got deployed somewhere else, and now they're trying to figure out how to stabilize the country, continuing to engage with them and such on other locations. That same deal did not exist for the Malian defense forces, the actual soldiers of Mali in the city. So the Russians left, and they just basically left the Malian forces to get, well, let's just say that they don't necessarily execute every POW, but the jihadists that are associated with the offensive are not, I don't expect them moderating anywhere close to what we've seen in Syrian leadership, which is still not exactly as moderate as I would like, but they're not getting anywhere near it. So this is like a terrible situation for the people of Mali. You've got the Wagner Defense Forces as your only hope. They're like a group of largely like thug soldiers who have engaged thuggishly while in service, and has also engaged thuggishly often in the prison system, because a lot of them are prisoners. And on the other end, you have the Azawad Liberation Organization, which is, of course, a group of Tuareg separatists. But at the end of the day, last time the Tuareg separatists worked with the jihadis to conduct an offensive, the jihadis boxed out the Tuareg separatists. So maybe in one scenario, we could imagine if the jihadis went away and, this organization was able to grab it, maybe they'd be more rational in negotiating than the other ones. They're a secular organization. They're not like, you could imagine in a scenario. But there's also the very likely scenario that the jihadis would box them out again. Of course, for the Tuaregs, they don't care. They want any opportunity possible to get the Malian government, from, in their view, at least the separatist views. Not everybody who is Tuareg's view. They're like 10% of Mali, but in their view, like to take their territory, to take the north of the country. I mean, they never got a country. When the French left and everything got cut up, they got like separated over 4 countries. I mean, they're not exactly like the Kurds, because obviously they have very different histories, but in the idea that their people are separated by 4 nations, Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq in the Kurdish case, and here you have it in Mali and 3 other bordering African states. So let me also just put forward that the other countries around there would not be too happy if there actually was a separatist, Azawad state, because it could eventually spill over. Or at least that, it might make other rebels that are in their territories, because these people cross the borders all the time, and those things don't matter to them. Definitely when you're out in the boonies of the north of Mali, of the boonies of Niger, the boonies of Libya, in the deep south, that borders don't matter that much over there. Sahrawi people as well. True. So anyway, that's the situation in Mali. But I saw one video that was very funny of a Tuareg, separatist fighter, putting on a garb from the governor of the region that, it was not a governor, but the highest military position in the region, and just dancing around in it. They're you can see them in the governor's estate, where they have the gold trimmed cushions and this big hookah and conference area, and they're just chilling, they're just vibing. They've taken large swaths of the north of the country, and the expectation is that they could take 2 other major cities. And after that, I mean, who knows? I'm sure that the Azawad Liberation Organization doesn't imagine that it needs to march all the way down to Mali's capital city, but that's them. The other half of the coalition, you're talking about the jihadis. I mean, they're jihadis, and they're not just any jihadis. They're not nationalist Islamists, as there are some organizations that are yes, I want Syria to be an Islamist state, but I have no, I'm not going to go into Turkey and make them Islamist. That's not our, there are people who believe stuff like that. No, these guys are transnational. They want to cross over in the Niger and Libya. I mean, we've already seen a lot of violence in Burkina Faso. It's been spilling over into other regions across the coast. This area around the Sahel is a hotspot for jihadi terrorism. It is also spilling over into some states that in the decades prior had not experienced them. Not in the same way that it is in the violence in northern Mali or the violence in say like Burkina Faso, but still in a very, very violent way. And the political instability, the military coups obviously did not help. In no instance we have seen yet, at least in this section of Africa, has one of these military coups of what is an internationally recognized democratic, where the civil society is developing, not to say that there weren't people who have, developed organizations, but to say that, this takes time to develop roots. This takes time to establish itself. There was no instance where this coup occurred and long term and ended up increasing the stability in the state in this part of West Africa, particularly across Sahel nation states. There have been instances where they've been able to increase it briefly before losing those gains. There's been instances where they've been able to stagnate it, but in a lot of instances, definitely when you're talking about the scale and the violence and the crossover, it has expanded. The jihadis that are fighting, that go down to the south more because they have a transnational vision, whereas the Azawad Liberation Organization is just working in the north of the country. They went to the capital of Mali. Zainab, you got to find footage of this. They went to the capital of Mali and besieged it. This happened under Russian support. This happened under Wagner support. They didn't stop everybody from entering Mali. They went in and they destroyed all of the fuel trucks that were entering the capital in an attempt to try to strangle the economic lifeblood and drive up prices, but also shut down society. And so they understand how to increase instability in the state. And so if the state is basically held together by strongmen and corruption and basically, and I don't want to say the blame game, but, anti-French sentiment isn't going to produce a outcome to get rid of these jihadis. It isn't. Anti-French sentiment isn't going to do that. Anti-Russian sentiment isn't going to do it either. Anti-American sentiment, no. There has to be a national vision for the future of Mali that encourages Tuareg people participation in politics if they're going to stay one unified state and there isn't going to be separate state. And there has to be competency in dealing with the jihadis, both from a military point of view, so they don't get encircled and they can continue their supply lines and they can continue their defense against the worst outcome, which is a jihadi takeover of Mali, which is the worst outcome. It is worse than every other outcome, and it is an outcome that will hopefully be avoided. I doubt the Russians' ability to put all of the effort that is necessary into this outcome because, when the French wanted to surge at 3,000 men, they could do it because they didn't have any other big wars going on. The Russians don't have that, I'm not going to say luxury, but they don't have that option. That's just not something that's on the table for them. And so I'm hoping, regardless of my views of Wagner, regardless of my views of the Russians, that there is not a total jihadi takeover of Mali. Whether there is an Azawad or is not an Azawad is not something that particularly inspires my beliefs one way or the other. I'm not from Mali. I'm not from the north of Mali. So I cannot tell you whether or not those people deserve a state. Many of them believe they do. And I base myself in national self-governance. I do believe that's important. So if they did want a state, I wouldn't be against it. But at the end of the day, if you are the Malian government and you want, number one, for the jihadis to not take over the country, and number two, because the number one is the primary objective, to be quite honest, right? You can stabilize against the jihadis if the north is somewhat taken over by the Azawad Liberation Organization. It would be harder for the jihadis to operate if the Azawad was not working with them because you made some deal with them and then box the jihadis out. But there's not, the Malian government is in no mood to develop a state for them. And I don't know how willing this new government is towards the issue of compromise with these people. But at the end of the day, that is the main priority. And so I hope the worst outcome is avoided. ISIS and Al-Qaeda have been active there for decades. Yeah, HTS developed a pseudo-state out of Idlib, out of the Idlib government. They developed a pseudo-state. They had to figure out how to keep the power on. There were times where the lights were on in Idlib, but the lights were not on in the capital of Syria because the rest of Syria had been so fucking decayed by the drug trade and corruption and Captagon flying everywhere. And, Bashar's brother just being a brute thug, and that's how the way law and order was kept together. And then a bunch of foreign mercenary groups, both Hezbollah support, Russia support. but like HTS actually practiced something that's somewhat somewhat resembling governance. That doesn't say it was perfect, of course. You know, they disappeared people, they did brutish things, but that is to say that when it comes to administration, like the new president of Syria or the current leader of Syria, before they have, you know, elections, which he will probably win, almost certainly win, because he's very popular. He actually like somewhat learned small scale governance before he was put in the role of big scale governance. That's why his adventure, I don't want to say adventure, that's why his journey from anti-American like Islamist fighter in Iraq all the way to where he is now, from transmitting from Al-Qaeda to Hayatir al-Sham. Hayatir al-Sham's like a part of ISIS. Then it broke off from ISIS due to disagreements and how they wanted the group basically to ram itself against the wall into pieces. And he prioritized the organization's survival and the survival of the areas that they controlled. They fought with ISIS then in like areas of support that still existed for ISIS, that had said that his leadership had not, gone along with them. From there to basically like putting down the fort in Idlib, surviving all of the crushing of all these pockets of resistance, especially in the south of the country, where it's particularly brutal, until eventually, after learning from previous like pokings and proddings and even the war in Ukraine, when it comes to like things like drone technology, they made a big offensive push, and it seemed like not many people were willing to put their life on the line to keep up this decrepit example of Syrian state management, what you want to say, administration, you want to even call it that. And then from there, he had to unite the whole country, a bunch of people outside of Idlib that have a bunch of different beliefs. Not only did he have to unite the country, he had to unite the country when different people had guns. There were guns in Druze populations. There were guns in Kurdish population. The SDF was and its people are still like a legitimate fighting force, even after agreements for integration. And so he was given these challenges and hasn't always done fantastically, but considering where he started, it's incredible how far he's gone. And I still just want to push back to, I think one of the few decent things Trump has done this administration is normalization with the Syrian government. Not because he's a man of the highest moral character and he will bring the country to a glorious democracy, but Syria needs to be given a chance. They need to be given a chance. After 13 years, that's the least they deserve.